March 22, 1959. A search party moves through the trees off Old Trails Road, 7 miles outside Spokane, Washington. Frost is still on the ground. Nobody is talking. A man pushes aside a pile of pine branches with his boot. And underneath it, he finds a 9-year-old girl. She has been there for 16 days. Her ankles are bound with a strip of cloth. That same cloth was torn from the slip she was wearing when she left her house on a Friday afternoon to go door to door selling boxes of mints. She was strangled with another strip of that same garment. Her name was Candy Rogers. She weighed 60 pounds. She was 4 feet 4 inches tall. And the man who did this to her would not have a name, not one written down anywhere, not one whispered in a single tip or a single police report, for 62 years. Retired police Captain Richard Oldenburg was one of the men who found her that morning. 6 decades later, he was still alive, and he was in the room when police finally said the killer's name out loud. This is the story of how a 9-year-old girl selling campfire mints became the center of the longest-running cold case in Spokane's history, and how she was finally given her answer because, in 1959, someone made the strange decision to seal a piece of evidence inside a plain glass mason jar. Before we go further, if stories like this matter to you, stories about the people who never gave up looking, hit subscribe now. Not for us, for her. Every share means one more person learns her name. Let's get into it. Spokane, Washington, in 1959, was not a city that watched its children closely. It didn't need to. West Central Spokane was a working-class neighborhood. Modest homes, familiar faces, the kind of street where every parent on the block considered every kid on the block theirs to look after. Doors went unlocked. Kids walked to school alone. Nobody set an alarm for when the children needed to be checked on. There was no reason to. Candy Rogers lived in an apartment above a small neighborhood grocery store on the 2000 block of West Mission Avenue. Her mother, Elaine, taught high school history and PE. Her grandparents lived next door, close enough that Candy moved between the two homes like they were one house with 2 front doors. She had a dog named Shep. She was small even for a 9-year-old, shy, quiet, the kind of kid who noticed things and said little. But she was a bluebird, the junior level of Campfire Girls of America, and that identity meant something to her. It gave her somewhere to belong and something to work toward. March 6, 1959, was the opening day of the campfire mint-selling season. Candy got out of school at 3:15 that afternoon. By 3:30, she was standing at her troop leader's front door, picking up her boxes. She could only carry 7. She was too small to manage more than that. The plan was simple. Sell enough to earn her sales badge, and maybe, if she sold enough, she'd be in the running for a free week at summer camp. They walked home together and waited for 4 o'clock, the official start time for door-to-door sales. In that half hour, Candy sat with her grandmother and ate an oatmeal cookie. She played with Shep in the yard. She talked through her route out loud, which neighbor she'd hit first, who was good for a sale, who might ask her to come back later. She was not nervous. She was excited. At exactly 4 p.m., Candy Rogers walked out into the cold March air with 7 boxes of mints and started knocking on doors. In the Pacific Northwest in early March, the light goes fast. By 5:40 p.m., the street lamps on West Mission Avenue were flickering on. Candy knew the rule every kid on that block knew. Be home before the lights come on. 5:30 passed. Then 5:40. No Candy. Her grandfather went out first, walking the block, checking with neighbors, expecting at any second to see her rounding a corner with an empty bag and a fistful of change. Nobody had seen her recently. Her mother, Elaine, had been at a hair appointment that afternoon and came home to a house that didn't have her daughter in it. Within the hour, the whole family was on the street. By nightfall, police had been called. Here is what made that first night almost impossible to investigate cleanly. It wasn't just Candy out there. It was opening day for every campfire troop in the city. Dozens of little girls in the same uniforms, carrying the same boxes, walking the same kinds of streets. Neighbors who thought they'd seen a campfire girl, around 5 p.m., couldn't say for certain whether it had been Candy or one of a dozen other children who looked just like her from a distance. Then, around 9 p.m., on a road called Pettit Drive, a steep climb locally nicknamed Doomsday Hill, searchers found something. Boxes of campfire mints. scattered across the ground. Not dropped the way a child drops something while running. Scattered, the way things fly out of a moving car window when someone is trying to get rid of them fast. The trail of boxes ran south, across the Fort George Wright Bridge, away from Candy's neighborhood entirely. One box had a partial fingerprint on it. It was carefully lifted and sent to the FBI. It would not be identified for over 60 years. By 9 p.m. that first night, Spokane understood something with a clarity that would define the next 6 decades. Candy Rogers had not wandered off. She had not gotten lost walking home in the dark. Somebody had taken her. By the following morning, the entire city knew her name, and more than 1,200 people showed up to help look for her. 1,200 people, searching for one 9-year-old girl. Marines, Boy Scouts, utility crews, mail carriers, men on horseback. A command post was set up right at the intersection where the mint boxes had been found. The U.S. Air Force sent helicopters to search from above. Remember, this is 1959. No cell phones, no GPS, no security cameras on porches. All they had were scattered mint boxes, one unidentified fingerprint, and a trail that ran cold at the edge of a bridge. And then the search itself turned into a second tragedy. On March 7th, one day after Candy disappeared, a military helicopter flying low over the search area struck high-tension power lines and went down into the Spokane River. 3 crew members were killed: Airman Marlis D. Ray, Staff Sergeant William A. McDonald, and Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fotek. 2 others survived the crash. 3 men lost their lives searching for a child the city hadn't even found yet. Spokane was now grieving in 2 directions simultaneously, and Candy was still out there. If you're feeling the weight of the story the way I did researching it, the 1,200 strangers, the helicopter crew who never made it home trying to find a little girl they'd never met, that's exactly why this case deserves to be remembered correctly. Drop a comment with just her name, Candy Rogers. Let the algorithm see that people still care 66 years later. It genuinely helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. The days that followed were quiet in the worst possible way. Tips came in by the hundreds, then the thousands from across the country. Detectives ran down every one of them. They pulled records on anyone with a relevant criminal history they could find, though in 1959, there was no sex offender registry to search, no centralized database, nothing but paper files and memory. Several suspects were developed. None of them could be tied to Candy with anything resembling proof. 16 days passed like that. On March 21st, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base were out hunting near an abandoned rock quarry off Old Trails Road, about 7 miles from Candy's home. Near a stand of trees, something caught their eye. A pair of small girls' shoes, set down at the base of a tree. Not kicked off in a struggle. Not dropped in a panic. Placed there. They reported it when they got back to base. The next morning at daybreak, a search party arrived at the site. Within minutes, one of the searchers pushed aside a pile of brush and dead pine boughs and found Candy, about 50 yards off the road. The cause of death was strangulation. The weapon was a strip of cloth torn from her own slip, the garment she'd been wearing when she left home that Friday afternoon. Her ankles were bound with another strip of that same slip. There was a mark around her waist suggesting she may have been restrained with a rope at some point, though no rope was ever recovered from the scene. The medical examiner also found evidence of sexual assault. Every piece of evidence recovered that morning was carefully cataloged and preserved, even though the investigators standing in those woods in 1959 had absolutely no way of knowing what future science might eventually be able to pull from it. They preserved it anyway. That single decision is the reason this story has an ending at all. The discovery of Candy's body changed Spokane for a generation. Parents who had never thought twice about children walking alone started watching from windows. New rules appeared on streets that had never needed them before. For decades, "Remember what happened to that little girl," was something Spokane parents said to their own kids, passed down like a warning label. Police had evidence now. They had biological material they had no idea in 1959 how to use. All they could do was hold on to it and hope that science would someday catch up to what they'd found. Before it did, a serial killer was about to walk directly into this investigation, and send it in the wrong direction for the next 40 years. For 4 decades, Spokane detectives believed they knew who killed Candy Rogers. They had a name. They had a pattern. They had a piece of physical evidence that seemed, on its face, to point directly at him. They were completely wrong. And the man who actually did it never appeared in a single tip, a single police report, or a single conversation in 62 years of investigation. The suspect everyone believed in was named Hugh Byron Morse. He was a member of the Spokane Motorcycle Club, the kind of man who moved through the community without drawing suspicion. When Candy went missing, he was one of the people who showed up to help search for her, walking those same streets alongside grieving neighbors and exhausted officers. He lived just a couple of blocks from Candy's home, and 4 years before her murder, in California, he had been picked up for attempting to molest 2 Girl Scouts who were selling cookies door to door. An unsettling echo of exactly what happened to Candy. Less than a year after Candy's body was found, Morse raped and murdered 2 women in Spokane, then continued across the country, committing at least 7 more violent crimes before he was finally caught in Minnesota in 1961, after a neighbor recognized him from an FBI wanted poster. He died in a Minnesota prison in April 2003, serving 2 life sentences. On paper, the profile fit. He targeted young girls selling things door to door. He was in the area. And then there was the gum. Morse had a signature. Investigators found grape-flavored gum at multiple crime scenes connected to him, consistently enough that it became something detectives specifically looked for. During Candy's autopsy in 1959, a detective noted a purple stain on her clothing that, when examined, had a faint grape smell. That single observation took on a life of its own. As Morse's pattern as a killer became clearer over the following years, that grape stain became the unofficial centerpiece of the case against him. Cited, referenced, treated as meaningful. It was never actually tested. It was never proven to be anything at all. It was an assumption that hardened into near certainty simply through repetition, and it quietly pointed 4 decades of investigation in the wrong direction. Then came 2001. Detective Mindy Connolly submitted Candy's preserved clothing to a forensic lab. Scientists isolated a semen sample and built a full DNA profile, the first time in 42 years that investigators had anything beyond circumstantial suspicion to work with. They tested it against Hugh Morse. It did not match. The grape stain, the parallel crimes, the geography, none of it mattered anymore. The DNA said no. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the National DNA Database, and came back with nothing. 0 hits. The real killer had apparently never been arrested for anything that would have put his DNA into that system. He had never surfaced as a person of interest, not once, in over 60 years. And here's the part worth sitting with for a second. There is exactly one reason this case was ever solvable at all. Not the detectives. Not the technology. Not the lab in Texas that would eventually crack it. All of those things mattered enormously, but none of them would have had anything to work with if it weren't for one decision made by an unnamed investigator back in 1959, decades before DNA testing existed in any usable form. Someone put a piece of Candy's clothing into a glass mason jar and sealed it shut. Glass doesn't degrade. It doesn't absorb moisture. It doesn't react chemically with what's stored inside it. That airtight seal, made by someone with no possible way of knowing what genetic science would look like 60 years later, created a near-perfect preservation environment almost by accident. When forensic scientists finally opened that jar in the early 2000s, the DNA inside wasn't just present. It was intact enough to eventually build a full profile from. Somebody in 1959, with no reason to believe it would ever matter, decided a mason jar was worth using. That single act of care is the entire reason we know the truth today. If that kind of quiet, unglamorous diligence means something to you, the people who do the right thing with no audience and no reward, let me know in the comments. I read every one, and it genuinely shapes which cases we cover next. Brittany Wright grew up in Spokane. As a kid, her parents told her about Candy Rogers, not as a news story, but as a warning. Watch where you go, remember what happened to that little girl. The case had become part of the city's inherited memory, passed down long after the crime itself. Wright grew up to become a forensic scientist with the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory Division. In 2018, When the Spokane Police Department began re-examining its oldest cold cases, Candy's file landed on her desk. The timing wasn't a coincidence. That same year, California investigators had used a brand new technique called forensic genetic genealogy to finally identify the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who had evaded capture for 40 years. The method worked by running unidentified crime scene DNA through consumer ancestry databases to find distant relatives of the unknown suspect, then building out family trees until genealogists could narrow the search down to a single name. The moment that arrest made international news, cold case units across the country pulled their oldest unsolved files off the shelf and asked the same question. Could this work for us? Spokane asked that question about Candy immediately. But there was a serious problem. The DNA sample, well preserved compared to what it could have been, but still 60 years old, had degraded significantly and was contaminated with non-human genetic material. In 2020, Wright sent it to a private genealogy lab. They sent it back. Too degraded, they said. They declined to take the case. That rejection came close to ending it for good. Cody's had already returned nothing. Every traditional avenue had been exhausted. If genealogical testing genuinely couldn't be done with what remained, the case was, for all practical purposes, finished. Then Wright heard about a lab in Texas called Othram, a company that specializes in exactly the cases other labs turn away. They'd developed a method they call forensic-grade genome sequencing, built specifically for degraded, contaminated, or nearly depleted biological samples. In February 2021, Wright described what she had. They said they'd try. She packaged up what remained of the evidence. By that point, she'd later describe it as being down to the very last drops, and sent it to Texas. Othram built a genealogical profile from what was left of the sample and ran it against an ancestry database. The results narrowed the field to 3 brothers, all deceased, all from Spokane. John Ray Hoff, James Andrew Hoff, and Terry Allen Hoff. Here's the problem with genealogy at that resolution. It can't distinguish between siblings. Brothers' DNA profiles look nearly identical on a family tree. To find out which of the 3 had actually left his DNA on Candy's clothing, investigators needed something else. A living relative willing to compare. Only one of the 3 brothers had ever had children. Detective Stormont picked up the phone and called a woman who had spent her entire life believing her father died because he was depressed. She had no idea what was coming. In 62 years of investigation, John Ray Hoff's name had never once appeared, not as a suspect, not as a witness, not even as a passing mention in a police report. Detective Stormont would later say it plainly at the press conference. Hoff wasn't on their radar at all, not for one single day until September 6, 2021. That was the day everything changed. When Stormont called Kathy Hoff, he identified himself only as a cold case investigator who needed her help. Within 45 minutes, she was at Spokane Police Headquarters. But by the time she walked through those doors, she already suspected something. In the gap between the phone call and the drive over, she'd gone online and searched, and somewhere in those 45 minutes, she found the story of a 9-year-old girl murdered in Spokane in 1959 while selling campfire mints. She walked into that police station already carrying the weight of what she feared was coming. She volunteered her DNA without hesitation. The results came back on September 8, 2021. The DNA recovered from Candy's clothing was 2.9 million times more likely to be related to Kathy Hoff than to any random, unrelated person. Her father was the man who had left that DNA on a 9-year-old slip in 1959. But investigators weren't finished. John Hoff was dead, which meant there would be no trial, no cross-examination, no courtroom defense to test the evidence against. That absence put the entire burden of certainty on the investigators themselves. They needed to be as sure as science could possibly make them. They obtained a warrant and exhumed John Ray Hoff's remains on September 23, 2021. The direct comparison came back on October 1st. The probability that the DNA on Candy's clothing belonged to anyone other than John Ray Hoff was 25 quintillion to 1. That's a 25 followed by 18 zeros. The case was solved. We're almost at the end of this one, and I want to ask you something honestly. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about the people these stories are actually about, not just the mystery of it. Hit subscribe if you want more of these cases told with the same care, the wins and the hard truths both. Costs nothing, and it tells us to keep doing this the right way. John Ray Hoff was born on August 11, 1938, in Spokane, his own hometown. He grew up on the 2500 block of West College Avenue. He wasn't a drifter or an outsider. He was local, known, familiar to the same streets Candy walked. His early life carried warning signs that, in hindsight, form a recognizable pattern. In 1955, at 16, he escaped from a state juvenile reform facility near Olympia and was caught near Yakima. That brush with the law pushed him toward the military. He joined the U.S. Army at 17 and was assigned to a Nike missile site protecting Fairchild Air Force Base, right outside Spokane, his own city again. On March 6, 1959, Hoff lived at 221 West Broadway Avenue. Candy's home on West Mission Avenue was 1 mile away. In 1961, 2 years after Candy's murder, Hoff was arrested in West Spokane on a charge of second-degree assault. He had grabbed a woman, forcibly removed her clothing, tied her up using her own garments, and strangled her before fleeing. She survived. Sit with that for a second. He used his victim's own clothing to bind her. He used her own clothing to strangle her. That is an exact match to what was done to Candy Rogers 2 years earlier. The ligature torn from her own slip, her ankles bound with another strip of the same garment. The 1961 victim survived only because something interrupted him before he finished. Candy did not have that. Hoff served 6 months for that assault. As a result of the conviction, the Army declared him a deserter and dishonorably discharged him. He drifted afterward, selling cutlery door to door, working a lumberyard, putting in time at a meatpacking plant where he suffered a chemical burn to his face. He wasn't building a life. He was just moving through one. And there's one more detail in this case that's difficult to say out loud. Hoff had a stepsister. In 1959, she was 10 years old, a Camp Fire girl herself. She was Candy Rogers' assigned big sister in the program, the older girl whose job was to look out for the younger Bluebird. She knew Candy. She cared about her. When Candy disappeared and the whole city fell apart searching for her, that little girl was devastated. She sat next to her own brother and cried, telling him how much she missed her little Camp Fire sister, how terrible it all was. John Ray Hoff died in 1970, before anyone could ever hold him accountable. He shot himself. The date he chose was his daughter's 9th birthday. The exact age Candy Rogers was when he killed her. Whether that was guilt, coincidence, or something else entirely, he took that answer with him. And when investigators went looking for where he'd been buried, they found something that made the room go quiet. For 51 years, John Ray Hoff had been buried in the same cemetery as Candy Rogers. The little girl he abducted, the child he strangled with her own clothing. She was there. He was there, yards apart for over 5 decades. While her family visited her grave for 51 years, wondering who had done this to her, the man who did it was lying in the same ground, in the same silence, in the same city. Nobody knew. His name had never entered the investigation, not once. When Detective Stormont told Hoff's surviving family what the DNA had confirmed, he described it this way at the press conference. I took those people's lives and their childhood and dumped it on its head. He wasn't exaggerating. Kathy had spent her entire life believing her father died because he struggled with depression. That was the story the family had built their understanding of him around. In a single conversation, that story was replaced by something no one could have prepared for. The grief didn't disappear. It just became something far more complicated to carry. When Hoff's family learned he was buried in the same cemetery as Candy, they made a decision without anyone asking them to. They arranged to have his remains moved to a different cemetery, so that Candy, in Stormont's words, could finally rest in peace. When Candy's family heard that, her cousin Joanne was overcome with emotion. It wasn't justice. Couldn't be. But it was the only thing the Hoff family had left in their power to give. There's still the matter of Hoff's stepsister. She's in her 70s now. After the case was solved, Stormont tracked her down and told her what her brother had done. He described her as absolutely heartbroken. She remembered, clearly, sitting next to John Hoff as a child and crying about losing Candy, telling him how devastated she was, How much she missed her little campfire sister. She had carried that grief her whole life as what she believed was an innocent bystander, never knowing the person responsible for it was sitting right beside her the entire time. Kathy Hoff gave a videotaped statement that was played at the November 19th press conference. She didn't hide from it, and she didn't deflect. She said she was very, very sorry for what her father did, that he took Candy's life horribly. She said she hoped it could give Candy's family some peace, knowing that even though it wasn't real justice, since he'd never face any punishment, his name was now attached to the truth, that it was solved. There would be no trial, no sentence, no moment in a courtroom where the law looked John Hoff in the eye and said what he was out loud. He had already escaped all of that by his own hand in 1970. But Kathy offered the one thing that remained available: acknowledgement. His name permanently attached to what he did. The record corrected. The truth finally on paper. It isn't justice, but it isn't nothing either. At the press conference, retired Captain Richard Oldenburg sat in the audience. The same man who, 62 years earlier, had pushed aside a pile of brush and pine needles and found what John Hoff left behind. He'd carried that image for 6 decades. He was still alive to hear the answer. "I thank God," he said, "that I lived long enough to see the end of this case." Detective Stormont, visibly emotional through the whole conference, was asked how many hours had gone into the Candy Rogers investigation over 62 years. He didn't give a number. He said this isn't measured in hours. It's measured in careers. 3 generations of detectives worked this case, one handing it to the next with the same silent instruction every time: don't give up on her. The last generation didn't. Candy's cousin Joe and wiped her eyes and said it simply: "I feel like Candy's loss was just a horrible loss. She was so cute, and she didn't have much time. She didn't have much time." Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She wanted to earn a badge. She had a dog named Shep, a grandmother who made her oatmeal cookies, and a whole street full of neighbors she was genuinely excited to visit that afternoon. She had a future that belonged to her by right, and it was taken from her on a cold Friday in March 1959 by a 20-year-old soldier who lived 1 mile away and was never once suspected. Not for 62 years. We will never know who she would have become. What we do know is this: she mattered enough that 1,200 strangers showed up to look for her. She mattered enough that 3 generations of detectives refused to let her file close. She mattered enough that a forensic scientist who grew up hearing her name sent one last sample to one last lab and refused to accept that the answer was gone for good. And she mattered enough that the daughter of the man who killed her looked into a camera, on the record, and made sure the world finally knew his name and what he did with it. 62 years, 8 months, and 13 days. That's how long Candy Rogers waited for someone to say the truth out loud. The clock has finally stopped. Before you go somewhere right now, there's a case exactly like this one. A family still waiting. Evidence sitting in a locker, waiting for a lab that doesn't exist yet or a technician who hasn't been born yet. If the story moved you even a little, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next one we tell might be the one that finally gets its answer too, and I'd rather you not miss it. Thank you for sitting with Candy's story today. She deserved to be remembered right.